It was just another Saturday at Oakwood Plaza Mall, the busiest shopping center in Lexington, Kentucky. Families wandered from store to store, kids tugged at their parents' hands, the smell of cinnamon and pretzels filled the air. It was the kind of day where nothing unusual was expected to happen. That changed the moment he walked in. A man in a sleek black blazer and jeans strolled past the automatic doors near the food court. His face, strikingly familiar, immediately turned heads. He wore dark sunglasses, but what caught the most attention was the red MAGA hat sitting bold and unmissable on his head. The bright color clashed against the polished atmosphere of the mall, standing out like a flare in the crowd. Whispers spread fast. "Is that Elon Musk?" A teenage boy near the fountain squinted, already pulling out his phone. "It can't be," his friend muttered, though he too had started recording. Why would he be here? In just minutes, people had begun gathering discreetly, their conversations buzzing with speculation. The man, however, acted as if he had all the time in the world. He strolled leisurely, pausing to glance at a display of drones at an electronics kiosk, his expression unreadable behind those reflective lenses. Meanwhile, in the mall security office, John Whitaker, the mall manager, was finishing up a briefing with his team. Known for his strict, no-nonsense approach, John had a firm stance on keeping the mall neutral and family-friendly. That meant no political displays, no disruptions, and definitely no viral spectacles that could turn into a problem. A sudden knock interrupted the meeting. Nancy, one of the senior security supervisors, stepped in, her expression more animated than usual. "John, you might want to come out here," she said, voice low but urgent. "We've got a situation." John raised an eyebrow, already rising from his chair. "What kind of situation?" Nancy hesitated. "Well, Elon Musk is here. Or someone who looks just like him. And he's wearing a MAGA hat." John blinked. "You're joking." "I wish I was." John sighed, already reaching for his radio. "All right. Let's handle this before it turns into a scene." A growing crowd. By the time John stepped onto the main floor, a crowd had already gathered. People whispered, phones held high, some pretending to browse while keeping their cameras locked onto the man in the red hat. John's jaw tightened as he spotted him standing in front of a bookstore, flipping through a book on artificial intelligence, ironically titled "The Future We Build." He moved toward the man, his polished loafers tapping against the tile floor. "Excuse me, sir," John said, keeping his voice even, firm but polite. "Can I have a word with you?" The man turned slowly, lowering his sunglasses just enough to reveal a face that was, without a doubt, Elon Musk, or someone who looked eerily like him. The air in the mall seemed to pause. Every phone was now pointed at them. "Yes," the man said, his tone calm, carrying a quiet authority. John forced himself to keep his composure. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you to remove the hat or leave the premises. We have a strict policy against political attire to maintain a neutral environment." The man raised an eyebrow, as if amused. "A neutral environment," he repeated. "Yes, sir," John said carefully. "Political attire can be polarizing. We aim to keep this mall a space where everyone feels comfortable." A small smile tugged at the corner of the man's mouth. "Interesting policy," he said, not moving an inch. "But I am afraid I have no intention of removing the hat." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people now openly filmed the exchange, capturing every word. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Sir," he said, his voice firmer now, "I am asking you politely. If you refuse to comply, I will have to involve security." The man slowly crossed his arms. The red hat stood out under the bright mall lights. "Do what you have to do," he said, his voice steady. "A standoff." John hesitated only for a moment before lifting his radio. The static crackled as he called for additional security. By now, the scene had grown into a full spectacle. Mothers with strollers had stopped in their tracks. Teenagers leaned over the railings on the second floor, watching the unfolding drama like it was a live event. Even the pretzel vendor had abandoned his cart, standing on his toes for a better view. The entire mall was watching. Within moments, 2 uniformed security guards arrived. One was Eric, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had been with mall security for years. The other, Mia, was newer to the job. She looked uneasy as her eyes darted between John and the man in the red hat. The man remained unshaken. He did not fidget. He did not glance nervously at the growing crowd. If anything, he seemed amused. John took a deep breath, standing his ground. "Sir, this is your final warning. Remove the hat or leave the mall." The man looked at the guards, then back at John. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something deliberate about the way he studied them, as if measuring what kind of man John was. Then, in a quiet, steady voice, he asked, "And if I do not?" His voice remained steady, almost daring. "Then we will have to escort you out," Eric said, stepping forward slightly. The man let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Escort me out? For wearing a hat?" He glanced around, then added, "Do you hear yourselves?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "This is ridiculous." "Let the guy wear the hat," shouted a middle-aged man in a denim jacket. "He is not hurting anyone," a young woman added, holding her phone high, recording everything. But not everyone agreed. "This is private property. They can enforce their own rules," someone countered from the back. "It is not about the hat, it is about keeping politics out of public spaces," another chimed in. The man took a slow, deliberate step toward John, his stance commanding yet not threatening. He lowered his voice just enough that John had to lean in slightly to hear. "Tell me something, Mr. Manager," he said, the words deliberate. "Is this really about the hat? Or is it about who you think I am?" John's breath hitched for just a second. It was a sharp question, one that struck harder than he expected. He straightened, clearing his throat, trying to keep his composure. "This is not personal, sir," John said, his tone clipped. "Rules are rules." The man nodded slightly, almost to himself. "Rules are rules," he repeated, as if testing the words. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his sunglasses. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Elon Musk," a teenage girl shrieked, her voice cutting through the din. The man said nothing. He did not confirm or deny. He just stood there, letting the moment settle. John felt a bead of sweat form at the back of his neck. This was not what he had signed up for. He was not just managing a mall anymore, he was at the center of a viral spectacle, one that was spiraling out of control. John took a deep breath, trying to regain some authority. "I am asking you again," he said, though his voice was not as firm as before. "Will you remove the hat or leave?" The man's smile faded. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his next move. Then, in a voice that was calm yet unshakable, he said, "No." Eric reached for his arm, ready to enforce the order. But the man stepped back, his voice rising just enough for the entire crowd to hear. "You are going to forcibly remove me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Go ahead. Let the world see." A crowd divided. The mall erupted. Some cheered. Others gasped. The sea of phones recording the moment now doubled in size. A few people started yelling at security to back off, while others defended the mall's policies. Mia, the younger security guard, shot a nervous glance at John. "What do we do now?" she whispered. John hesitated. No matter what he did, someone would be furious. And by nightfall, this would be all over social media. Before he could respond, the man raised a hand, signaling for silence. And shockingly, the crowd listened. The noise died down, people leaning in, their curiosity at its peak. The man turned to John, his voice calm but firm. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "But before you make your decision, maybe you should hear why I am here." John exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. He wanted this to be over. But even he could not deny that the entire mall was hanging on the man's next words. "All right," John finally said. "Let's hear it. But if this is some kind of stunt." "You will understand soon enough," the man interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. He clasped his hands together and took a slow step forward. His presence alone commanded attention. "This is not about a hat." "You all think this is about a hat," the man said, glancing around the crowd, making direct eye contact with a few onlookers. "But it is not. It never is." A hush fell over the crowd. Phones stayed locked on him. The sea of people grew, spilling into nearby corridors, drawing in shoppers, employees, and passers-by. Some workers leaned against their counters, watching intently. Store managers stood in their doorways, captivated. John folded his arms across his chest, trying to maintain control of the situation. The man gestured lightly toward him. "You are just doing your job," he said. "Enforcing policies. Maintaining order. I get it. But sometimes, the rules we cling to do more harm than good." John sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look," he said, his patience thinning, "I do not know what point you are trying to make. Let me finish." The man raised a hand, not aggressive, not demanding, but commanding all the same. A collective "oh" rippled through the crowd at the subtle rebuke. John clenched his jaw but motioned for him to continue. The man took a deep breath, then looked out over the sea of faces before him. "Imagine this." His voice carried, steady and measured. "You see someone walking down the street, wearing something you disagree with. Maybe it is a hat. Maybe it is a shirt. Maybe it is just the way they look. It makes you uncomfortable. So, you decide they should not be allowed in your space. You tell yourself it is about principles. That it is about protecting others from discomfort. But really, it is about fear. Fear of what they represent. Fear of what you do not understand." The words settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. Some people nodded in quiet agreement, while others shifted uneasily. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Then, a voice rose from the crowd, cutting through the silence. "But why the hat? Why here?" The question came from a young woman in a striped sweater, her phone still locked onto the man, recording his every move. He gave a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Good question. I will get to that." He turned back to John, eyes sharp. "But first, tell me something, Mr. Manager. What do you think people are really afraid of when they see this hat?" John hesitated, caught off guard. He had been prepared to handle defiance, not deep, probing questions. "It is not about fear," John said finally, his voice measured. "It is about keeping this mall neutral. Like I said, politics do not belong here." The man tilted his head slightly, considering John's words. "Neutrality, huh? Interesting concept." He took a slow step forward. "But neutrality is not silence. It is action. It is letting people exist together, even when it is uncomfortable." The crowd stirred, murmurs rising in volume. A few people clapped softly, though most were still trying to figure out where this was headed. Meanwhile, on social media, the event was exploding. Nancy, the security supervisor, stepped beside John, her phone in hand, eyes wide. "We are trending on Twitter," she whispered. She turned the screen toward him, showing a flood of posts, comments, and live streams under a rapidly growing hashtag. #MAGA at the mall. John exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "I cannot just let this go." The man, as if sensing John's growing frustration, stepped forward again. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, raising his voice just enough to command attention. "I did not come here to start a scene. I came here for a reason. And yes, this hat is part of that reason. But it is not the reason you think." The murmurs swelled. Curiosity was overtaking skepticism. Even John found himself leaning in slightly, against his better judgment. "Then why are you here?" someone in the back called out. "Yeah. What is the big deal?" another voice added. The man's lips curved into the faintest smile, but behind his eyes was something deeper, something heavy. "I will tell you," he said. "But first, let me ask you something. What would you do if everything you thought you knew about someone changed in an instant? Would you listen? Or would you shut them out, just because of what they were wearing?" The weight of the question pressed down on the crowd. A few people looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, hungry for the answer. John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it up between his fingers, his expression solemn. "This," he said, unfolding it slowly, "is why I am here." The crowd surged closer. Phones zoomed in, trying to capture the document in his hands. John's stomach tightened as he squinted at the paper, trying to make out what it was. "What is it?" someone yelled. The man's expression softened, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, forcing everyone to lean in. "It is a letter," he said. "A letter from a young woman who works here. She wrote to me asking for help. And that is exactly why I came." The crowd erupted into whispers, the energy reaching a fever pitch. A letter? From someone at the mall? The idea seemed absurd. People exchanged bewildered glances, but no one lowered their phones. John's arms crossed defensively. "A letter? And what does that have to do with you, or with any of this?" The man finished unfolding the paper, glanced at it briefly, then raised his gaze to the onlookers. His tone softened, carrying a weight of sincerity. "This letter," he said, "is from a young woman named Kaylee. She is 21, she works at the food court. And she dreams of going to college one day." A gasp rippled through the crowd. In the back, a girl in a green apron holding a tray of napkins froze. Her face turned pale as recognition hit her like a train. "Oh no," she whispered, her hands trembling. "She wrote to me," the man continued, his voice steady yet carrying a weight of emotion. "Because her mother's medical bills are burying them. She has been working 2 jobs just to help keep the lights on. And even with everything she has been through, she is still trying to save enough to go to community college." The energy shifted. The tension that had once filled the air, the sharp divide of confrontation, was slowly melting into something more profound. Empathy. Even John, who had stood his ground so firmly, felt the knot in his stomach loosen, replaced by an unfamiliar flicker of unease. He cleared his throat. "What does this have to do with you?" His voice was quieter now, no longer sharp with authority. "Why would she write to you?" The man smiled faintly, his gaze meeting John's directly. "Because," he said simply, "she believed I could help." He lifted the letter again, turning slightly toward the crowd. "Kaylee did not send this to just anyone. She sent it to me, Elon Musk." And then, for the first time, he said it outright. "And for the record, yes," he continued, his voice clear and unwavering, "that is exactly who I am." The mall erupts. The moment the words left his mouth, the crowd exploded. Gasps, shouts, the sound of dozens of phones zooming in on his face. Some people were already comparing him to the countless photos and videos they had seen on the news. "I told you it was him," a teenage boy practically yelled. "No way. This is insane," another muttered, shaking his head. Even John, usually the calmest person in the room, felt his mind spinning. He had been arguing with Elon Musk. In his mall. Over a hat. Wait, what? John finally managed to say, barely above a whisper. Musk let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. You did not believe me before, and I get it. This is not exactly a typical day at the mall. The real reason he came. Musk turned back to the crowd, his voice growing steadier. Kaylee's letter moved me, he said. He glanced toward her, but she was still frozen in place at the back of the crowd, hiding behind the soda machine. She did not ask for money, Musk continued. She did not ask for charity. She asked for advice. Advice on how to balance her dreams with the weight of her family's struggles. She thought maybe I could give her some kind of guidance. The crowd hushed as his words sank in. Kaylee's name was now on everyone's lips, whispered between strangers. People turned toward the back of the food court, eyes scanning for her. And when they found her, there was no escaping it. Kaylee steps forward. Kaylee could feel the eyes on her before she saw them. People pointing, whispering, nudging one another. Her face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear. But then, she heard her name. Kaylee. Musk's voice was gentle, yet firm enough to cut through the murmurs. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching, until they found her. You do not have to hide, he said. Come here. Her heart pounded. Her co-workers nudged her forward, whispering encouragement. Finally, with shaking hands, she stepped into the clearing, her green apron still tied around her waist. The crowd parted, giving her space. Musk smiled warmly as he handed her the letter. You were brave to write this, he said. And you were right. I want to help. Kaylee's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she took the letter back. You actually read it, she stammered. I did, Musk said, his voice firm. And I came here today because I wanted to meet you in person. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of the moment hit her. I do not understand, she whispered. Why would you care about someone like me? Musk placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his expression full of conviction. Because, Kaylee, he said, people like you are the reason I do what I do. You are the future. And you deserve a chance to build something amazing. The moment that changed everything. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people wiped their eyes, overcome with emotion. Even John, still reeling from everything, found himself clapping hesitantly, caught up in the moment despite his earlier frustration. Kaylee sniffled, quickly wiping her tears. But I do not know what to do next, she admitted, her voice trembling. I am just trying to survive. Musk nodded, his gaze steady. Then let us start with this. He reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to her. This is for you. Kaylee took it with trembling hands, her fingers barely able to peel it open. She hesitated, then carefully pulled out the check inside. Her breath caught as she scanned the number. The crowd leaned in, eager to know what it said. Her voice cracked as she whispered. It's $50,000. The cheers erupted once more, even louder than before. People clapped, whistled, and shouted in excitement, the earlier tension completely wiped away by the weight of what had just happened. The sound filled the entire mall, replacing the heated confrontation from minutes earlier with something far more powerful, a moment of unity. Kaylee stood frozen, clutching the envelope as if it might vanish if she let go. Her co-workers surrounded her, patting her back, congratulating her, some with tears in their eyes. The energy in the room was electric, with everyone eager to capture this once-in-a-lifetime moment on their phones. John hesitated before stepping forward. The manager in him, the man who lived by the rules, was at war with the human in him, who had just watched something he could never have anticipated. Mr. Musk, John started, his voice quieter now. I did not know about this situation. If I had. Musk turned to him, his expression calm but firm. You did not know because you did not ask, he said, his tone sharp enough that John flinched. The truth cut deep. "You saw a hat and made a judgment," Musk continued. "I get it. Rules are rules. But sometimes, rules need to bend when there is a good enough reason." John lowered his gaze, shame creeping into his chest. "You are right," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I was so focused on enforcing policy that I did not stop to see the bigger picture. I am sorry." Musk's face softened. After a moment, he nodded. "Apology accepted." Then he glanced at the crowd, his voice steady and sure. "Just remember," he said, "people are more than what they wear, or what opinions they hold. Sometimes, it is worth pausing for a moment to see the person behind it all." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some nodded thoughtfully, others whispered among themselves, reflecting on what had just been said. A promise for the future. Musk turned back to Kaylee, his smile returning. "This is just the beginning," he told her. "Use this opportunity to chase your dreams. And when you are in a position to help someone else, pay it forward." Kaylee wiped the last of her tears, her hands still shaking. "I will," she whispered. Then, more confidently, "I promise." The story goes beyond the mall. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the energy shifted once more. The event had been recorded, shared, and discussed in real time, making waves across social media. Within hours, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines framed it as an unexpected act of kindness from one of the world's most influential figures. Back in his office, John scrolled through Twitter, his stomach twisting as he read the comments. Many praised Musk for his generosity and Kaylee for her courage. But others were not as kind to John. The criticism was blunt. Power trip. Ridiculous policy. Why was this even an issue in the first place? John sighed, feeling the weight of public opinion in a way he never had before. Yet, amid all the negativity, one comment stood out. "Sometimes we all need a reminder to see the humanity in each other. Lessons learned today. Let's do better." John exhaled slowly, the words sinking in. He had spent years enforcing rules. Maybe it was time to start seeing people instead. A night of reflection. That night, Kaylee sat at her kitchen table, the check still resting in her hands. Her mother, frail but smiling, reached across the table, squeezing her daughter's fingers. "You have always been a fighter," she said softly. "And now, you have the chance to do something incredible." Kaylee nodded, the determination in her eyes growing stronger. She did not know exactly what her future held. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something real. Something tangible. Hope. A quiet departure, a lasting impact. Meanwhile, Musk's departure from the mall was as quiet as his entrance had been. He declined interviews, waved politely to those still lingering, and slipped away without any extra fanfare. But what he left behind was bigger than the moment itself. It was not just about Kaylee. It was about everyone who had been there that day, everyone who had witnessed something that made them think, made them feel, made them reflect. The aftermath. The next morning, Oakwood Plaza's management released a statement. They apologized for how the situation had been handled. They promised to review their policies, to ensure a more inclusive environment. And John? He wrote the statement himself. Because this time, he was not just enforcing rules. He was learning. He was growing. And he vowed to approach his role with more compassion and understanding moving forward. A story bigger than one moment. The story went viral, sparking conversations across the country. It was not about a billionaire. It was not about a hat. It was about how we see each other. About judgment. About compassion. And about how the smallest acts of kindness can ripple out further than we ever expect. Kaylee's story inspired others to share their own struggles. It led to a wave of support, community-driven initiatives, and people thinking twice before making snap judgments about those around them. More than just a confrontation. In the end, what started as an argument over a hat became something much greater. A lesson. A reminder. That no matter how different we seem, there is always something that connects us. Even in the most unexpected places.